And welcome to the Troutman Battery and Storage Podcast. This is your host, Bill Derasmo. We are here with the second episode of Season 2, and I am very pleased to have as our guest today Mr. Jeff Bishop, the co-founder and CEO of Key Capture Energy. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Bill, for having me.
Well, Jeff, I'll just start with a brief introduction. You have an MBA from Chicago, Booth, and a BS in Electrical and Computer Engineering from Rice University. You're working on your Master's in Electrical Engineering at the University of Utah. But the really cool thing is you helped start Key Capture Energy, and I was wondering if you could talk to us at the start here. Just give us some general thoughts on what is it like to start a company? What goes through your mind?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I have been in clean energy since 2002, where I worked on a wind farm over in Morocco. And then since then, I rode the wave of the real start and growth of an industry in onshore wind energy. And so did that extensively through the 2000s, early 2010s. And, around 2015, 2016, started noticing the same legislative and regulatory chatter around large-scale storage that existed about 10 years ago for large-scale solar. And at that time, 2007, 2008, 10 years before, I was doing all the financial models for a wind energy company. And I'm just like, yeah, this solar, it ain't ever going to happen. It just doesn't make any sense. The CapEx isn't there. And I didn't realize the power of the rapidly declining costs based on supply chain growth. And so whenever you go from, 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 units of solar panels or of batteries, costs drop about 20% over time. And so 10 years ago, I totally missed solar actually becoming a thing and didn't want for that to happen here. So at that time, I put together a business plan and, I went to, my company that I was working for before, a, large multinational clean energy company. And basically I said, all right, guys, I don't actually know how you monetize these projects. Nobody's done them before in New York or down in Texas or, over in New England. But something's here and I don't really understand it, but something's going to happen. And somehow that's not really a convincing business plan or, market case for a multi-billion-dollar company. So at that point, if I couldn't do it internal, it's just like, well, if not now, when? I was single at that point and didn't have responsibility, to family. So just started up and never wanted to be an entrepreneur, never wanted to be a CEO, but here I am. So
that's fantastic.
It's been fun.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic to hear, especially the part about, never wanted to be an entrepreneur, because that gives hope to a lot of us out here who have ideas and think, oh, but I could never, that's an exciting path. And I remember talking to you a few years ago when, you came into our office in DC and you're talking about Key Capture, and I guess that was probably around 2016, 2017, somewhere in there. But it was very much, and I've, doing this podcast and then going back a few years with some of the things I was involved in, same kind of feeling. It's like there was something there. Now we got to figure out how to monetize it and make it work. And you've been heavy into the Texas market and the New York market, and then there's a project I think I mentioned that was close to my heart in Rockland County, because that's where I grew up. Rockland County, New York. For our audience out there, it's the lower Hudson Valley in New York State. But in any event, if you could just speak to what might be the attractive nature for Key Capture and your business plan for why New York works well or worked well and Texas.
Yeah, so with us today, we have 254 megawatts of standalone storage and construction or in operations. And we have a development pipeline of around 2,500 megawatts, might be up to 3,000 at this point. But storage is really, really hard. And so we didn't want to do the scattershot method and, put in development positions in a bunch of different states. Instead, it was we wanted to do a couple of states really, really well. And so being the first into a market where we're the first, doing batteries in the way that we are, the, utility scale size ones, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. Like for instance, when we started in New York, we knew that frequency regulation would be a use case that, had a significant amount of revenue and where batteries are uniquely positioned to do it. And so with frequency regulation, basically every 6 seconds in the market, you really need to adjust your supply and demand such that the overall frequency of the grid stays at 60 hertz. And so with batteries, every 6 seconds, they can charge, they can discharge, they can move around. But the issue for New York ISO was that they didn't actually have a frequency regulation model that was published. And so it becomes a question of how will the battery actually behave? Like, are you actually going to be called every 6 seconds to do something different? Is it only certain times of the day? If you have a 10 megawatt battery, do they only need 3 megawatts of that, or are they going to take the full 10? And in order to figure out what it was, like we had to develop our own algorithms. We had to sit down with New York ISO staff, 8 times, both in person and on the phone. We had to, work with our vendors in order to just say, all right, well, we think it's going to be like this, but in reality, there's a band of uncertainty around it because nobody's ever done it before. And so all of these combined, it's just really, really hard. So hence why, we decided to only focus on a few places and do them really, really right. And then for New York, they're doing everything all at once and then clean energy transition, which leads to some really weird, wonky things in the electricity market. When you are phasing out all coal, last coal plant retired 2 days ago, the 2 gigawatt Indian Point nuclear facility, is now in retirement. And so whenever you have that combined with 9 gigs of offshore wind coming in, combined with 1 to 2 gigs of onshore wind plus solar every year, combined with, retiring downstate fossils, there's just weird things that happen. And that's where batteries are really, really good. We provide capacity. We can do really quick responses to what the grid needs. And so we knew that New York was going to be a very promising market for us. We just didn't fully understand at the time on how the market would evolve. And, we're still learning.
Right. Well, but it sounds like it's all moving in the right direction for the kind of things that your batteries can do. I mean, and that primary frequency or frequency regulation or primary frequency response, I'm familiar with that because I lived that fight in MISO.
In MISO, yep.
The complaint case.
2016.
Yeah. And
I've read that complaint case, IPL.
There you go. Yes. Yes, as you mentioned, IPL. So I'm very familiar with the every 6 seconds and bringing things into balance. And so it is a very effective use, obviously, of storage. And I think with the continued drive to retire fossil-fired units, that'll continue to be a need for the grid, right? When you lose that inertial response, which is literally the inability to have those turbines slow down because you don't have those turbines anymore. So, so it's an interesting conundrum, and it's interesting to hear that you guys were attuned to that from the start. It sounds like in New York.
Yeah, and with that, frequency regulation, it's a relatively small market,
Right.
but initially it's, a market with a lot of revenue in it. And so hence, it's a good start for batteries in the market. But then in reality, over time, we really focus on capacity prices. We focus on, energy arbitrage opportunities. We focus on 10-minute reserves. And so, it's the same thing you went through 5 years ago where, you identify a market product that is able to pay your battery back. And you do that, you learn, you iterate. And then as the prices continue to decline, then it just opens up a lot more markets and a lot more different use cases.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that in terms of, when you look at the different use cases. So obviously we just talked about frequency regulation, primary frequency response, so ancillaries. But what about the straightforward energy case? So if you got an energy solar plus storage, and you've got the ability to store the energy and then obviously release it at times of high demand or high prices. What does that use case look like, or how does that pencil out for you guys differently than, say, an ancillaries case?
Yeah, so we only have one project that's just doing ancillaries and ancillary services alone, and that's our first project in New York. Every other project, they have to do it all.
Okay.
And so, for instance, we have two 10-megawatt projects over in West Texas, and they're smack dab in the middle of the Permian Basin, the fracking capital of the world.
Right.
And basically, our thesis there in 2018 was that the amount of fracking is far surpassing what the utilities had expected. And so there weren't enough transmission lines, which will lead to some really insane price spikes. And we knew that would, basically be eliminated in January 2021, whenever new large-scale transmission lines were built to West Texas. But there would be a period of time where there would just be really large, price volatility. And so hence we put projects on there and started that in early 2020, getting those projects online. And one of the projects was cycling about 3 times a day, where there would be a morning spike where the wind would die down in West Texas and before the solar came up. So you had a morning spike. You had the evening spike, where the inverse of that, where solar goes down, wind starts coming up. And then in between, they really need capacity. And then there would just be random midday spikes, which, I still don't fully understand. And so that battery had to get cycled really aggressively in order to, be able to maximize revenue. Compare that to another project that we put online on the coast of Texas, where really the highest use of revenue there is to be able to be in reserves for most of the time. And when the grid needs power very quickly, then we discharge. And outside of that, there are going to be some interesting times where you can do energy arbitrage. But in reality, that's not the best use case for that one. And so the tricky part in all of this, and I remember the one and only contracts class that I've ever taken in my life. How do you design the actual contract with the system vendor and with the battery manufacturer in order to say, like, okay, we might be hanging out at 90% state of charge for a full week and do nothing, or we may need to cycle 3 times a day. And both of these have very, very, very different implications as far as battery degradation, as far as system health, as far as your air conditioning requirements. So really working on all the contractual legal stuff, like that's been utterly fascinating to me because it's hard, it's weird.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, what you're talking about earlier in what you were saying, it reminds me of a couple of years ago when we would go to these conferences and we were talking about all this stuff, and we would talk about, hey, you really have to figure out a way to stack these services and monetize the stack. We can't just do one thing and get paid for frequency regulation or just energy. We've got to be able to do it all. And it sounds like that's most of your batteries are in that spot. And then as far as the contracting regime, I mean, absolutely, that is a hot topic or hot issue right now, and people are in it. And it sounds like what contracting parties have done is create capacity-like products and different variations off of that. But you're right, it's a challenge because being compensated, for energy versus spinning reserves versus ancillaries. I mean, all of those things. If you're in an RTO market, you might be able to figure out a lot easier, what your battery was called on to do. But if you're not in an RTO market, then it certainly becomes a challenge to capture all of that value.
Definitely on that. And it's fascinating too because, in the non-RTO markets, the vertically integrated states, then it becomes a real process on the integrated resource plans and how the state actually procures whatever
Yeah.
market attributes it needs. And
Right.
so then it's all about education, where for instance, we intervene in a few integrated resource plans and are doing more, where a lot of the assumptions for energy storage, they're outdated. And so
Okay.
whenever they are trying to plan what requests for proposals they're going to be doing for new capacity, they're comparing us, with 4 or 5-year-old data to a new natural gas peaker. And the natural gas peaker looks better just because their modeling is wrong. And so a lot of it now is just the educational process in the integrated resource plans where, it's use the right assumptions and suddenly, game on, we can play.
Right.
And like enough utilities and enough states and enough public utility commissions have now approved battery storage projects as, the prudent thing to do for the ratepayers. I think that dynamic is going to be shifting.
Oh, that's all the chatter that I pick up and that I hear. I mean, and you have a good example, although it's New York is obviously in the New York ISO, but the Rockland County project that I'm fond of because that's where I grew up again. But the project that you're doing, the Pomona non-wires alternative, right? I mean, that's a great example of where you can get in there and say, hey, our battery solution, our storage solution is going to be more efficient for the ratepayers than a traditional transmission project.
Yeah, and there's always going to be an inherent tension with that, where, for instance, this project, Orange and Rockland, they're, a very innovative, utility. And with them in 2015, 2016, they noticed in this one area in Rockland County that, they really just needed peak reduction during certain hours in the summer. And if they could just squeeze out an extra 1 or 2 megawatts of load reduction, then they wouldn't have to do tens of millions in transmission upgrades. And so they worked very collaboratively with the Public Service Commission in New York, with other stakeholders, and really have designed a multifaceted approach where it's a combination of demand response and some energy efficiency. And then they put out this request for proposal in 2017 for a battery to provide the load reduction in the summertime when they really need it. And then outside of that, then they can participate in the wholesale market and then, be able to, recover even more revenues, that goes directly to the ratepayers. And so it was a great project, as far as the approach and as far as how they thought about it. And it really did save the ratepayers a lot of money. And so hence, like non-wires alternatives like that, where on distribution lines where it may be really expensive in order to put down new cables, put down new transformers, batteries really excel there.
Well, and in that Rockland County case, so you were saying if they make market revenues, that they basically there's a form of revenue crediting back to their load.
Yeah, so I'm somebody that loves the regulatory side, so I read all the dockets that are out there, state level public utility commissions, FERC dockets, what have you. It's fun. But
you're a sick man.
but there's some debate now where it's like, all right, well, should the utilities be able to get any of the wholesale market, revenue? And really our approach, as a company has always been there's storage is a big tent. Like there's room for everybody. Like the utility ownership can definitely happen. They know their grid better than we do, especially on distribution lines. And, obviously as a storage independent power producer, we want, access to as many markets as we can. But we won't be getting a lot of these non-wires alternative opportunities where we can compete to offer the services they need. Unless the utilities can make some wholesale market revenue on them too. If they're just comparing the cost of us without those revenues towards, a new transmission line, we may not look that favorable. And so, so hence, I'm still not entirely sure of the crediting structure on that between Orange and Rockland, ratepayers, Public Service Commission, New York ISO, all that good stuff.
Right,
But
right, right.
these are the conversations that are just happening everywhere right now
Well,
because it's tricky.
Well, it's tricky, but there's sort of well-trod ground on that, right? I mean, there's been different forms of earning sharings, as they call it, or revenue crediting that have existed for a long time, and like you said, it's a big tent, and if it truly is a more efficient solution, then there ought to be a way to figure out how to share those savings and share any incidental market revenues, as I call it sometimes. And then market revenues, as time goes on, might not be so incidental. But there ought to be a way, I think, given the decades of regulatory history on these types of things, where people have figured out a way to do kind of earning sharings. So
Exactly.
well, and one thing before we leave New York, I wanted to mention. I mean, just for the audience in general, the retirement of Indian Point is a huge deal.
Yeah.
And again, maybe I'm biased because I grew up in that area. But when I was a kid, and I don't want to date myself, but it was a while ago, unfortunately, they were talking about closing Indian Point then, and it was just seen as, look, it's a load pocket. We need that base load energy. It's non-carbon emitting. But as time went on, societal preferences, I guess, and policies shifted, and so it's been closed, and it's a huge deal. It really is for New York State, and regardless of what you think about nuclear, and you could, I think, as someone who's an attorney, I could make a good case either way, but I think it's just going to be a continual challenge for the state to meet that Southeast energy and Long Island need. So. And it certainly creates a lot of opportunities, I would think, for people in the market. So just something to keep, be aware of and keep an eye on as that situation continues to develop. One of the things I wanted to hit and sort of shift gears is, so again, starting a company and going out and getting money so you guys could function. What I guess I've always been interested in this question, but what are the differences maybe when you go to the equity market versus when you go to the debt market? And I have a friend of mine who he jokingly talks about the debt market as, oh boy, lenders council. He's like, they're always the people who say, okay, I don't like that rock. Bring me a different rock. It's sort of the debt council are sort of very exacting in what they want and what they need. Not that equity wouldn't be, but it just strikes me as maybe there's a cultural difference there, but maybe there's some hard and fast differences. And if you could talk about, with what you're comfortable talking about as far as when you started up Key Capture Energy and what your money people were looking for.
Yeah, no, it was really interesting because even in 2016, so we started the company up, me and my co-founder, Dan Fitzgerald of Albany, New York. And then for 6 months, we didn't take any outside money because we wanted to be convinced that we had something before, we went out to friends and family. And then we raised an angel round, which was primarily my former colleagues from Horizon Wind Energy, EDPR, and everybody in that circle from, the last 10, 15 years. And then when we, a year later, 6 months later, went out to raise our first equity fund, everyone wanted completely de-risked projects with 15% unlevered returns with 20-year contracts. And they were fun conversations because, it's like, all right, like I could get you the 15% returns, but the rest of that doesn't exist yet. Like there's non-contracts on these. We have to figure out what the contracts are. And so, I interviewed, I think 30, 35 different equity firms, got offers from 4 or 5, and, went with the one that we were just ideologically most aligned with. And, that's been working out great on that side. But then on the debt market, I have been talking with debt providers since 2017, and they would always ask me, like, when are you bringing me something? And my answer was, we're both not ready. And with that, they haven't got enough through their credit committees and I didn't have a big enough portfolio to, work with the opportunity cost. And so the opportunity cost to a small organization doing debt financing, it's exhausting. There's so much due diligence involved. And it's just it does take up a lot of resources in order to do it. But for the first of their kind projects, you really have to. And so we were hoping and waiting for like NextEra to be the ones that like fully led the way, so that way we come in after. But for the case of our Texas projects, yeah, we were like, all right, well, this is a big enough portfolio at this point. It's 230 megs of operational and under construction projects. Hence, like the time is now. And we had a great lending syndicate on that side, so that's been wonderful. The fascinating part for me is I grew up in the tax equity world with wind, and I've always struggled with tax equity because it's a great market, but they want equity returns for debt-like risk, and it's nice not having to go through trying to figure out how to monetize tax credits right now. So that way, debt providers are looking for debt returns on debt risk. So it's a lot more stringent, but I'm okay with that.
I am so happy to hear you say that because I've been, again, with the bring me another rock analogy from the Lenders Council, right? And I said, I know these guys are tax equity, but they sound like a bring me another rock crowd from the debt side. And that's exactly what I think you just said. My understanding is, yeah, and my understanding is that the tax equity is getting very choosy because they can. So it's a tricky play, and I've worked on the regulatory side some projects that involve tax equity, and so it's been interesting to observe. And with possible changes in the law, that may become a dimension, obviously, to what you guys do.
Yeah, no, it's going to be real fascinating to see how this all evolves because. Yeah, like as you said, tax equity, the real big guys, like they can choose who they work with, and which makes it hard for up and comers, like like my company. And anytime you have to wrap your mind around a new technology, wrap your mind around different markets, around different products, and really understand what the upside and downside risks are, it's just hard. And so, and then too, like our contract types, like just being in the debt market instead of being in tax equity. Tax equity, they want everything completely wrapped up, 10 or 12 year minimum contracts, de-risk as much as possible. Right. And in the debt market, it's more about covering your debt service. And so because of that, you can have a lot more flexibility in your offtake agreements where they don't have to be 12 years. They can be, 4 to 8. They can be for, a portion of your project where you still have a merchant component. And so there's just a lot more flexibility, which leads to a lot more contracting types. But obviously, if the entire market moves into a tax equity world, then, we'll have to adjust and do that as well.
Sure, yeah. No, but that's very interesting to hear you walk through the differences. And on the equity side, it's also interesting to hear what you said before about, you were able to find someone who was sort of philosophically aligned with what your goals were and what their goals as a fund, I'm assuming, were and what parameters were around that fund. So, that must have been an interesting process, to start with. Once you, as you say, you got past the sort of friends and family initial round, which is exciting, but probably also a little bit nerve-wracking. And I don't know if you could just talk for a minute about, sort of the minute your company was sort of born and you're like, okay, now I'm responsible for this group of people's money. So
yeah, it's, I probably don't do like the normal pitches and, like I remember one of my angels, a former Goldman Sachs banker, he was really pressing on me where he's like, what's your elevators pitch? And I'm like, I don't really have one. These markets are tough. We don't think we've figured it out, but we think we're farther ahead than other folks. And so it's really just kind of a bet on like, do you think this market is going somewhere? And so, whenever you approach raising money like that, instead of you'll get 2% of this $10 billion market, whatever, it's just different. It was terrifying accepting that first check. It was terrifying hiring our first employee. Whenever we closed with equity, back in July 2018, we signed 2 days before, our first $1 million CapEx contract. And, we had $100,000 in the bank. And we told this to them, before we signed, where we're just like, hey, like we got this equity lined up, but there is a chance, in 5 days when, the money comes due that, we can't pay. And, that's all like part of like the normal like startup story where Richard Baxter, former Lazard designer of the energy storage, view on what the costs are. He explained it to me where he's like, in every single startup, there's always a line of, and then a miracle occurred. And it's the same thing with us, where it's like, we were like, on that knife edge where it's like, yeah, it could happen or it could go, horribly wrong. And you work to de-risk as much as possible. But, it's a startup. So you're never quite sure.
Yeah, no, it was funny when you were talking about, well, they want projects, that are de-risked. It's like, well, it doesn't everybody. I mean, that's one response, right? It's like, or you'll see descriptions in the trade press about what a company is looking for, and they'll say, well, we like mature, product, or, mature pipeline development. It's like, well, again, doesn't everybody? It's like
yeah.
nobody wants to take the risk on the early stage projects.
Like a really, really tricky part just on the risk is
Sure.
actually fully understanding where the risk lies. And we thought we knew where a lot of the risk lies, but it's the unknown unknowns in the market. Where even just going back to Indian Point, where it's a 2 gigawatt, 38 miles north of New York City, 40 somewhere around there, and in an area that desperately needs generation and has a lot of load. And so even if you wanted to put a battery right there, could you charge it? Where it's a fundamental question where it's like, all right, well, if you're in a load pocket, either there or in the Bronx or in Manhattan or whatever, can you really put more load on? And to the extent that a battery needs to be able to charge. And so there's all sorts of stuff that 2, 3, 4 years ago, we got lucky in a lot of cases where we happened to site projects in electrically stable and robust areas of the grid that today we have a team that has to go through the analysis and figure it out. But yeah, I mean it's super weird. Just first time in a market, figuring out the unknown unknowns and really just trying to understand where the risks actually lie.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend he's the same friend who talked about the bring me another rock analogy. He talked about, well, these project attorneys, all they do is assign risk. It's like, well, you wear that risk. No, you wear that risk. But again, it's a challenge is to find where the risks are, right? And that's part of the diligence process, and that's something, maybe a reason why you pay lawyers or consultants to look at these different things. But, for some of these risks that you're talking about, there's not going to be insurance available, right? I mean, if it's an environmental liability, you can go out and buy an exotic insurance product. But if it's something like you're talking about, like, hey, are we going to be able to actually charge our battery? That's a risk you may not be able to deal with in that manner. So
that is completely correct. Yeah. And like really like the risk should always be borne by the party that understands it best.
Right.
And so like all of our contracts, both offtake and with, our battery manufacturers, system integrators, like I always just go back to that as a principle where it's like, your system way better than we do from a degradation perspective. And as such, like you need to be taking on different risk than we do. But whenever it comes to regulatory change, yeah, that's on us. Like that's not on anybody else. So, if they decide in New York to abolish, the 10-minute reserve market, and that's no longer a revenue source for us, then that's on us. And it's it's weird assigning those risks and having to do that in every single stage of a project development. And yeah, like by the time you get to the debt financing, you think you've, identified and fully gone through all the risks associated with that, but, new ones pop up. And that's where, like, especially like that relationship with equity and with debt, in order to just be like, look, like things will go wrong. We don't know what it is yet, but, like we just assume everybody will work together on this in order to get out of it. And, so that's like really choosing your partners on the finance side is incredibly key.
Well, yes, and I've heard that from many others, that it's that relationship building, which is sort of something like it's intuitive or just a life lesson, right? But when you have these long-term relationships, they tend to be able to handle and withstand those types of issues better. Even development partners, we work with a utility that's used the same development partner on some of these build, BTA type deals, build transfer agreements, and when you have that ongoing relationship, it's just obvious that if a deadline slips or whatever, it's not fatal because, hey, this is the fifth project we've been developing together. I need you to cut me some slack on this one, and then it works out. But yeah, in terms of the de-risking and risk allocation, I mean it's a fascinating ongoing process, I guess. Well, the final question I'll ask, and you were saying how you're crazy enough to go and try to understand the regulatory stuff, and I guess this is going to sound really geeky, but my understanding is that these warranty contracts, the warranties on the batteries and how those are drafted is extremely important, and then how you use them against that is critical. And so I don't know if you can speak to that for a minute.
It is super fascinating where there are many, many things still unknown as far as what actually fully degrades a battery. And so, for instance, if you keep your battery at 100% state of charge with lithium ion, every year it'll probably lose 1.5% of its overall capacity, just by being at 100%. So if you have a 1 hour battery at, the end of the first year, 59 minutes, and it just goes on down the path. So that's one form of degradation. And so optimally there you would just keep your battery at 40% state of charge, but that may have market implications. Cycling your battery aggressively up and down has a big impact on degradation, but it's probably not nearly as bad if you cycle up for 5 minutes, cycle down for 5 minutes, etc., compared to just going all out at, discharging for, the entire time. And so really trying to understand and be able to put in what your marginal cost of production is really tricky. So whenever you're bidding into the market, if you are, at full max for an hour of output, that is a very different degradation structure rather than, if you're at 50%. And so your bidding strategy should reflect that. It should, be based on your marginal cost. And your marginal cost here is, the cost of the battery degradation. So basically what I'm saying is, I know they're critically important. I know they completely and totally matter. But, for a 20-year project where, you have to stay within certain bands on temperature, humidity, use case, etc.
It's a new area, and it's probably a good time to give the disclaimer, which we put on there anyway. But we're not giving legal advice, and Jeff's opinions are his, and not necessarily the opinions of his company. So should not. This is just a conversation. On that note, I know you're very busy. You're CEO, so we should probably. I could talk about this stuff all day, which is probably a bad sign, but we should probably wrap up. I mean, I really appreciate you joining the podcast and just having a free-flowing discussion. Really fascinating for me, and hopefully for our audience. I think it will be. And I hope you enjoyed your time on this podcast.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it. And I mean, I love talking about this stuff. And it's just market evolution and like the intersection of like regulatory, commercial, finance, technology, there's just going to be super, super weird, wonky things in the next 5, 10 years that none of us fully know. Like fork order 2222, like that's going to blow the market out of the water. Once like me as a battery storage, utility scale developer, once I'm competing against like Tesla aggregating 20 million electric vehicles in 10 years in the wholesale market, I don't know how any of this stuff is going to go. So yeah, it's going to be a fun decade.
Yeah, well, I think, I appreciate your candor in, you said it more than one occasion, look, these are issues that are out there, and I'm not really sure how they're going to play out. That there's a book out now that I'm reading called Think Again, and I have no connection to the book. It's not an endorsement, but it's an interesting book that I'm reading. I can't remember the author's name, but he says early on that is a very good sign, and it's actually. So I'm complimenting you. A lot of really intelligent people have the ability to say, you know what? I didn't know that, or that nobody knows the answer to that right now. Let's go try to figure it out. Or they're also open to having their mind changed, and that's the whole point of the book. Is this Think Again book is you should always be open to having your mind changed, and it's probably a lesson beyond energy, right, for our society right now, is that people get sort of stuck in these camps, and so anyway, it's an interesting discussion. But I think it's refreshing for me to hear from the lawyer's chair, to hear someone who's in the thick of it right now saying, you know what, I'm not sure how that's going to play out. It makes me feel better.
Totally appreciate that. Yeah, and really thank you for your time, and thank you for having me today.
Well, thanks again to Jeff Bishop, our guest from Key Capture Energy. And, I never gave a plug to the website. KeyCaptureEnergy.com is his company's website. You can read more about him and all of the company's projects. And we thank our audience for joining us. This is the second episode of Season 2, and we hope you'll join us again in the future. Thank you.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.